Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you all very much for having this paper of mine. So this is joint work with Denis Sosyura, who's also a colleague of mine at ASU. And this paper is titled CEO Pet Projects. So there's this tension between what we teach our students in finance and some of the frictions that exist in real life. So ideally, we want CEOs to set projects that maximize value to shareholders. But because of incentive misalignment, CEOs might be selecting projects based on other characteristics. So for example, they might be selecting projects that provide themselves with private benefits that cannot be directly consumed by the owners of the firm. And so in this paper, we call those projects pet projects. And so in that sense, pet projects are at the heart of agency theory, where past theory work has studied how the switch between CEOs and owners' preferences impact firm in terms of decisions and outcomes. But despite all of the theory work that has been done, the empirical evidence to directly pin down the existence of those projects has proven to be challenging. And that's mainly in light of four key aspects. First, we do not usually observe firms' opportunity sets. By that, we mean that we usually observe what firms are doing, but not what they could have done. Second, we do not usually have the ability to identify pet projects among the pool of projects that have been conducted by the firm. Third, even if we're able to identify pet projects, quantifying or getting a reasonable measure of the private benefits that directly accrue to CEOs only is not possible. And fourth and finally, we do not usually have the ability to compare the performance of those pet projects with any other projects that are conducted by the same firm at the same point in time. So by that, we mean that we do not usually have project level performance data. And so in this paper, we're among the first to reveal how CEOs' monetary benefits impact firm in terms of project selection, sequencing, and project outcome. So how do we do this? In this paper, we again work with oil and gas data. And so we focus on the oil and gas industry in the United States. And in total, this is 229,000 distinct oil and gas wells that we have in our sample. Now, to give you a sense of the size of what we're working with, the total CapEx value for the projects included in the sample is equivalent to $1 trillion spent across 19 states and over 20 years, so from 2000 to 2020. And so in addition to overcoming the four key challenges that we identified in the previous slide, one benefit of working with oil and gas data is that we're working with fairly homogeneous projects. They all share the same production function, they're all wells. And so to give you a sense of how this production function translates in terms of project cash flows, you can look at the graph here. So on the x-axis, you get the number of years since the project was drilled, and on the y-axis, you get the cash flows associated with that project. And so at time zero, before the project starts producing, you get one large negative lump sum payment. That's basically the cost of drilling that well. So if you want to think about it, the cost of putting the straw in the ground to get oil and gas out of it. And then from year one and going forward, the project starts producing. There are two key features of this production function that are key in the analysis that we have. The first one is that production declines in an exponential fashion. The second one is that peak production happens in the first year of that project. We'll use that dimension of the production function to design some of the tests that we have at the end of the paper. So that will be important for us in the analysis. Now, how do we identify those pet projects? To conduct the analysis, we focus on the one specific type of CEO's private asset, private land that is located on oil and gas formations. There are two main reasons for us to focus on this type of private asset. The first one is that those assets tend to be economically important for the CEOs that we have in the sample. So the mean investment value is about $1 million per property. And the second one is that those assets tend to directly benefit from exploration and production activity, because this type of activity tends to confirm the potential of the oil and gas formation, and thus improves the lease term that landowner can get, but also increase land value in the surrounding region. So we'll be a bit more precise about that and provide you some empirical evidence on these things. Now, we can break down the finding of this paper into three subsets of results. The first one is about resource allocation. So what we find is that CEOs are about 3 times more likely to enter fields that are associated with their personal assets. We find that this effect is stronger in period of high oil prices, so basically when there is greater managerial slack. We also find that CEOs tend to invest 7 percentage points more of CapEx in fields that are associated with their own assets. And so if we are to take those results together, it suggests that CEO's personal benefits, personal monetary benefits, tend to impact firm resource allocation on both the extensive margins, the likelihood to enter in a region or not, and the intensive margin, by how much I invest in that particular region. For the second set of results that we have, we're looking at project performance. And so the goal of that part of the paper is to help us disentangle which competing story appears to dominate in the data. So is it an information advantage story from the CEO side, or is it an agency story between the CEOs and the owners of the firm? What we find in the data is that CEO pet projects tend to underperform other wells that are drilled by the same firm in the same year in similar regions. In terms of economic magnitude, that's about a 12% lower initial output value. And so taking all of those results together, the way we think about this work is that CEO private assets tend to add additional location constraint on firms' resource allocation, and thus it leads to suboptimal resource allocation. The third set of results that we have in the paper is about governance. And so what we find is that pet projects tend to perform worse when CEOs have stronger control right in the firm, or when they face weaker monitoring from their shareholders. Finally, we do a battery of robustness tests in this paper to rule out selection, local bias, and reverse causality, and we show that the result is robust under those alternative specification of the data. And so just to wrap up on the findings, what we find in the paper is a null link between CEOs' private assets and firm capital budgeting decisions. So how do we do that in the data? How do we identify CEOs' investment properties? So what we're showing you in this picture is basically a bird's eye view of an oil and gas field. And what we're thinking from a conceptual standpoint in this paper is what would happen if the CEO were to own some of those plots of land on the firm resource allocation associated with that overall oil and gas formation? Would they invest more? And if they were to invest more, would that lead to suboptimal outcome? So in terms of data, we gather information on 298 distinct firms with a 50-50 split between public and private firms. One thing that we want to point out here is that we believe that the oil and gas environment is a great laboratory to test this type of question. And this is an environment that is economically important to the US economy. So what we're showing you on this graph is on the x-axis, you get dates, and on the y-axis, you get proportions. And what we see is that the energy sector represents about 8.4% of the S&P 500 in the median year of our sample, but it also represents about 10% of the total US capital expenditure in the median year of the sample also. But this is an environment that is economically important in terms of resource allocation on both the financial market, but also in the real US economy. Now, turning back to data again, we collect information on 412 of those firm CEOs. So critically for each of those CEOs, we have the full history of real estate transaction. We have the exact GPS location of those properties, as well as the full list of inherited properties. We'll use that last point in some of the robustness tests that we conduct in the analysis. And so in total, what we end up with is 155 distinct investment properties that are located on oil and gas formations. So importantly, to be included in the sample, the land to total value must be, the land value to total value of those properties must be greater than 50%, and they must be located on oil and gas formations. To give you a sense of how we're getting this data, we're showing you here an excerpt of LexisNexis. And so basically what we have is the person name, so basically the persons that purchased that property. So in this case, what we have is Charles Davidson, that is one of the CEO in our sample. We have the address of that property, so we'll use that information to get the GPS coordinates of those properties. We have the land use, so for example, here this is farmland, so like basically large plot of land that have nothing else built on. And we also have the sale information, so we know that this property was bought in 1999. And crucially for us, for the final filter that we impose on the data, we need to be able to identify land property from any other type of property. So for example, here, the land to market value is greater than 50% by a large amount. And so this is why that property was included in the sample. And so just to wrap it up on the data slide, what we were showing you, what we have in this sample is what we believe to be a great laboratory. So basically this is a laboratory that provides us with precise data on both the CEO's private assets, but also precise data at the project level. But this is also an environment that is economically meaningful to the US economy. Now, just to give you a sense of how we're matching those two data sets together, we can look at the example that we're showing you on this picture. So looking at this picture, each individual red dot represents a distinct well that was drilled in the property vicinity at some point in time. So for each of the well in the sample, we have the exact GPS location and the exact initiation date. So basically, we know where they're drilled and when they were drilled. We also have the ability to identify exactly where the CO's property are located and the period of ownership for those properties. And so basically, by using dates and GPS coordinates, we have the ability to match those two data sets together. What this enables us to do is to quantify those monetary benefits that accrue to landowners in regions that are associated with the start of drilling activity. And so to quantify those monetary benefits, we look at two dimensions of the data. The first one is about lease terms that landowner can get. And so to give you some magnitude, what we find is that the increase in royalty rate that accrue to landowner is equivalent to an extra $100,000 in discounted cash flows for each well that would be drilled on someone's property. Now, for the average CO in our sample that owns investment properties, if we assume that there would be 2 wells that would be drilled on their property, this is equivalent to an additional $338,000 in their pocket, or about 21% of the average CO current compensation as measured on xKDR. We also look at the change in land value surrounding the start of drilling activity. So what we're showing you on this graph is on the x-axis, you get the years surrounding the start of drilling activity in a property township. And on the y-axis, you get land market value per acre. And so what is very salient in this picture is that the start of drilling activity is associated with a 45% increase in land value. And so to give that, to give some magnitude for the average CO in our sample, this is an equivalent jump of $306,000 in property value for those guys. So those two change in economic value are what we believe to be economically meaningful for the COs in our sample. Now I'm going to turn to the first set of results that we have in the paper, which is the decision to enter or not in an oil and gas field. Just to give you a sense of the dispersion of the data and like the over time and geographically in our sample, we can look at the picture here below. And what we're showing you is that oil and gas exploration during the sample period spans from California right up to Pennsylvania and from Texas right up to Montana. So it spans a large section of the United States. Now, what we have in this first specification, the dependent variable is an indicator variable equal to 1 if the firm enters the field at that point in time and 0 otherwise. One thing that we want to mention is that fields is what we believe to be a highly granular geospatial unit of analysis. So the average oil field in our sample has a mean radius of 33 miles, and we have 1,500 distinct active oil and gas fields at some point in the sample. The variable of interest is CO personal investment. So again, that's an indicator variable that takes the value of 1 if the CO owns an investment property on that field at that point in time and 0 otherwise. In terms of economic magnitude, we find that COs are about 3 times more likely to enter an oil and gas field when they own an investment property in the surrounding region. One thing we want to point out is that the result that we're showing you here is not dependent to some econometric specifications. So specifically, what you see in this table is the OLS result, but in the robustness of the paper, we also run the result with a Cox hazard rate model, and we find a similar interpretation in the data, such that firms tend to be quicker to enter oil fields when the CO owns an investment property next to them. What we also want to point out is that the result is robust to including a large set of high-dimensional fixed effects. So specifically, we have a firm year fixed effect to control for the investment opportunity set of the firm at that point in time. We have a field year fixed effect to control for the overall investment attractiveness of that field at that point in time. And we have a CEO state fixed effect to control for the specific relation that this CEO would have with that particular location. So think here about home state bias, for example. And so the result is robust to including gradually all of those set of high-dimensional fixed effects. We also conduct a large set of robustness tests. So as I just mentioned, we have the CEO state fixed effect to help us rule out the local bias. We also have multiple set of controls, such as the distance between the firm's headquarters in that a particular field to control for monitoring or ability to monitor activities in those fields. And so the result is robust to the inclusion of that control. We also rule out reverse causality by replicating the analysis with properties that were acquired before the CO appointment, or by replicating the analysis with properties that were purchased before oil deposits were discovered in that field. And again, the result is robust here. And finally, we look at managerial slack, and we find evidence that are in support of this idea of agency, such that the effect is stronger when oil prices are higher. So basically when there is greater free cash flows in the firm. And so just to wrap it up in this first main result that we have, CEO's monetary benefits tend to impact firms' resource allocation and the extensive markets, the likelihood to enter or not in a region. Now turning the attention to the intensive margin, so by how much they invest in those regions, we have a similar specification. The only difference that we have here is that the dependent variable is investment rate. And so what we find is that firm investment tend to respond more when CEOs have personal interest with fields. So in terms of economic magnitude, firms tend to invest 7 percentage point more in fields that are associated, 7 percentage point more of CapEx in fields associated with their own personal properties. Again, that result is robust to including the large set of high-dimensional fixed effects. We also look at the interaction term between CEO personal investment and field overall productivity at that point in time. And so what we find is a negative coefficient, and the way we think about this relation is that it suggests that pet investment tend to be less sensitive to field quality or to the marginal productivity of that field. And so if we are to take those two results together, does it mean that CEOs tend to overinvest in their pet projects? So to investigate that last part of the paper, we look at project outcomes. So basically disentangle information versus agency story. So a few things I want to point out before we dive into the results. The unit of observation in that specification is slightly different. Now we're working at the well level. So this is at the project specific level. And the interpretation of this dependent variable is that this is the value for the first year of production of those wells. The variable of interest also takes a slightly different interpretation. It's an indicator variable again that takes the value of 1 if that well was drilled on a field that is associated with the CEO's investment property, and 0 otherwise. Now, to be more precise about exactly what is the source of variation and how we are coding this variable, I think it's useful to go over one graphical example. So in the data, we have the ability to distinguish between the fields. So for example, in the example that we have here on this picture, we have field A and B in blue and red. We also have the ability in the data to identify which field is associated with the CEO investment property. So for example, field B is associated with the CEO's investment property in our data. And so for the variable of interest to take the value of 1 in this specification, we look at all the wells that the CEO's firm have drilled on that field. And so for each of those wells, CEO personal investment will take the value of 1. And for any other wells that this firm is drilling, it will take the value of 0. Now, as we mentioned, we usually include a large set of high-dimensional fixed effects. And just to give you a sense of what is the source of variation that we're capturing and how we should be thinking the interpretation of the coefficient that we're getting, we want to give you a little bit more information here at the graphical level. And so looking at the picture that we have, when we include the firm year fixed effect, what we're effectively comparing is the firm treated wells, so the wells that are in yellow, with any other wells that are drilled by the same firm in the same year. So basically, the interpretation that we would be looking at when we're looking at the coefficient of interest would be what is the performance of those yellow wells versus the performance of those purple wells. This is how we should be thinking about it in the data. Also, we usually have a township year fixed effect. And so this enables us to compare a firm whose CEO owns a property nearby with any other firms that do not have a CEO that owns property nearby. And so we are looking at a very granular level of difference between the projects. So intuitively, what we're doing when we have this township year fixed effect is that within a given square on the map, what is the performance of the yellow well versus the performance of any other wells? So here the wells tagged in green. Now, going back to the data, in terms of economic interpretation, what we find is that CEO pet projects tend to underperform versus any other wells that are drilled by the same firm in the same year. In terms of economic magnitude, that's about the 12% lower initial output value. As I just mentioned, this result is robust to including those set of high-dimensional fixed effect, and the interpretation changed slightly, but the magnitude of the coefficient that we get still remain economically meaningful. So what are the likely contributing factors? What can explain this negative relation that we find in the data? So if we were to look at all the set of results that we showed you so far, what we find is that CEOs tend to overinvest or drill too much in regions that are associated with their investment properties. The way we think about this set of results together is that this is probably associated with location constraint. So CEOs do not consider all the regions with the same level of appeal because they have personal investment associated with some regions. Now, to provide further evidence about this interpretation, we look at governance and project performance. So what we find in the data is that the performance of those pet projects tend to deteriorate when CEOs have face weaker monitoring from their shareholders. So basically, when ownership concentration is higher, the performance gets better. We also find that in private firm, the performance of project gets better. So basically, the way we think about that is that underperformance appears to be driven by public firm in our sample. There's this, basically, in public firm, there's a starker separation of ownership and control. And so this is where it seems to be, this is where the data seems to be suggesting that most of the negative relationship is happening. And we also look at cut of the data that looks at situation in which CEOs have stronger control right in the firm. So basically when they are chair and CEO. And again, we find that firms for which CEO does not have a full set of control. So when the CEOs are not chair in the firm, the performance of pet projects tend to be better. So we take all of those results together, and it suggests for us that governance appears to mediate this channel, such that better monitoring from shareholders or weaker control from CEOs in the firms appears to generate better outcome for pet projects. One last thing that we want to mention in the paper is that the result that we show on performance does not depend on the specific specification of the dependent variables. Specifically, what we show is that the result is robust to defining the dependent variable as the internal rate of return for the projects by looking at the net present value for those projects, or by looking at an indicator variable that is equal to 1 if the net cash flow of the project is negative or 0 otherwise. And so the way you should be thinking about this last result, so for the unprofitable well, we find that CEO personal investment are 4% more likely to be unprofitable in the data. And so just to wrap it up in this paper, what we show is a novel set of evidence about how CEOs' private assets impact firm resource allocation overall. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Paul. That was an amazing presentation. Very scary results. Can I invite Aneesha to discuss Paul's paper?
Let me try and share my screen. All right. Thank you, Susan, for firstly inviting me for being a discussant for this paper. Apologies that I couldn't read through the paper entirely because it was like a little last-minute reading for me, and I just went through it once. And so these are the points based on my one-time reading of the paper, and the presentation also is a little patchwork, but I did not want to miss out on the previous presentations. So this was done in a hurry. So apologies for that. First and foremost, I think it was a fantastic paper trying to sort of support the agency theory, which is not just with the case of oil and gas extraction, it is also true with the case of many other public projects. We have seen that with the case of political parties, ministers, and bureaucrats trying to develop their own areas where they own lands, so on and so forth. So there is a lot of evidence to sort of support this kind of the analysis and the conclusions that come from this paper. So I just like to summarize what the paper put forth was pet projects are those which provide like private gains for the CEOs. They are usually invested in underperforming projects. They tend to reduce investment efficiency as a trade-off for increasing the private value of private assets of the CEOs, and definitely it is implied that it leads to poor monetary outcomes for the shareholders. The main findings of this paper was with respect to the investments. You have positive investments in areas which are in close proximity to the property of the CEO or the big bosses, and that happens basically through development of exploration projects or oil projects, so on and so forth, in close proximity to those CEOs' lands. It also said that firms are 3 times more likely to invest in such projects. They are more quicker to enter and make investments and less sensitive to project outcomes, suggesting that even when the output is low, it's negative, they tend to continuously invest in those projects. Right term that was put out was overinvestment, right? Okay. So I would really like to appreciate that the previous presentation sort of spoke a lot about this this industry, so I do not have to go too much into detail into it because it was an eye-opener for me as well, thanks to the previous presentation by Michael and the discussion by Rick. So clearly, as Rick mentioned earlier, US has amazing database, something that we developing countries are definitely very envious about. Such granular data is not found in developing country contexts. So having data with respect to the private assets of CEOs, not just their assets, but also their family assets, the close blood relatives, siblings, parents, spouses, children. The basic time frame for the study is from 2000 to 2020, it's a 20-year period. They also go into taking out the data regarding project cost data. One question that arises, do they take other kind of externalities added to it? So I will come to that point a little later. They control for CEO characteristics, land property, family relations, and other controls. The study tries to suggest that even when we control for something which is like land and property purchased before the CEO's appointment, which says that the CEO did not go and make the purchase after he knew that he would go and dig a well there. It controls for that. It also controls that the purchase by the CEO had happened much before the discovery of the oil and gas. And also it's purchased close to the family property. So all this just goes to state that the CEO wasn't aware that he was going to invest in that land, but once he comes into the position, he's doing so that he can develop that area and then gain private benefits from increased market value of his property. So these are some of the points that I have put out from my reading of this paper. The first point that I would like to sort of like ask the authors is, do you control for the CEOs moving across companies? And when this finding still finds, and this finding holds true. Why I ask this question is, the median age of most of the CEOs is like 50 plus, and they may have worked across various firms in that time period. And do they tend to showcase this kind of behavior all throughout, or is it only so that when they are like in their prime and they have more decision-making capacity, they tend to invest more in the areas that are close to their land holdings, or close to they drill the wells more close to their families holding the land. The sample period spans over a very volatile time frame, which is like from 2000 to 2020. The study sort of considered the impact of the global financial crisis, where there was like a sudden big shock to the economy, especially for, and also with Trump presidency. We see that there was much push for these kinds of, actually suddenly the CEOs were like, okay, let's drill more wells, or sort of they found more impetus to go ahead and do so. Also, I find the kind of oil wells that are concentrated are overlapping with the red states. So political economy that we all Indians are so obsessed with comes to play, and we are like asking this question that, okay, oil drilling is more given more easier clearances and easier permissions because they are red states, and maybe that's the reason why these CEOs tend to go ahead and sort of have the capability of drilling wells so as to increase their own personal wealth. Even before the angular or the non-vertical extraction was a standard practice, which became so after 2005, does that have kind of an impact in suggesting that the CEOs who came to like these positions after were more prone to develop their own personal assets by drilling wells in the close vicinity of their land. And also this question arises that this point is made in the paper that investments closer to CEO's property are less likely to be exited. So the money keeps pouring in even when they become relatively less productive. What are the exit policies? Is it like you tend to have another well which is more abundant, or you buy a well, or you tend to move into another sort of space or another geographical location? So what are the exit policies, and does that have an impact? And also separating the CEO and chairman position. Now, the study made this kind of statement and conclusion that public firms were where the concentration of power is more to CEO when they hold also the chairman position. They tend to exercise this power to sort of drill the wells or invest in areas close to their lands. What happens in case of private firms when the position such as the chairman or board members is taken up by family members? This also holds true. So that's my very short discussion of the paper, and thank you. It was quite interesting read. And with that, I would like to end the slideshow.
Thanks, Aneesha. Paul, would you like to respond to any points that Aneesha made, or can I open up the discussion to the floor?
I mean, like, very quickly, thank you very much, Aneesha, for the discussion. I think you made a few very good points. Just going over over your comments, I'd like to point out just one or two. You talk about private firms. So we have this set of results in the paper. So we look at the effect between public and private firms, and we see that most of the result is in public firms. We don't find much evidence about negative performance in the private firms. We did, in the new iteration of the paper, went slightly deeper than that. And so we have information on the size of those firms using Dun & Bradstreet data. And we also find that most of the effect is concentrated in rather large firms. So basically firms that have more than 50 employees. So you can think of that as firms in which it's much less likely that the owners is managing that firm. And so the separation between ownership and control would be weaker there. So we find evidence suggesting with that comment. But overall, thank you very much, Aneesha.
Thanks, Paul. I'm opening it up to the floor. I have a couple of comments, but anybody else wants to step in and respond to Paul? Rick?
Yeah, I just had a couple of thoughts. So the first one, I think you addressed one. So it is possible that, I mean, there's an information story and you are seeing sort of the project performs worse. That may still be possible under 2 or 3 potential reasons. So I'm trying to rule them out one at a time. First is, on average, the project will perform worse, but because it's close to you, you are more sure of the signal quality, and therefore you kind of are okay taking a low mean, low variance project. I think your net negative profits, something that would rule this out. But I would still, I would be curious about what happens about, I mean, what do you see with respect to the second moment, whether you see anything different or not?
Yeah, that's a super good point, Rick. This is why we added this unprofitable result, because we wanted to dive a little bit more into this. Do they just take projects that have less uncertainty because they know more about the region? So I think looking at the first moment, looking at is it just a better project or a worse like a project that is destroying value, expectation talks more to the first moment. When we look at the second moment, like more variation in the projects, we don't find much difference in there.
The other thought I had, which is of this sort, is the costs of the projects that you measure are of course the direct costs, but there may be administrative costs, so administrative overheads, which you will not be necessarily able to capture. And it is possible that if the CEO has some role, these are not enormously big firms from what I understand. If it's huge, then this won't work. But in moderately sized firms where the CEO may still play a role in actually sort of individual projects, there may be gains from saving the time of the CEO, which can offset sort of the expected lower value that you're going to get from the projects, because you don't know net of that gains of administrative costs, which way this is going, basically. I mean, this is all ex ante, right? So ex post, it may turn out that on average, you're even seeing a higher probability of negative, higher probability of sort of non-positive outcomes in net profits. But ex ante, it might still have made some sense. So that's one thought I had. And the only other thing is the private versus public, you mentioned that I missed it. Was it matched for size, or because the private and public firms would also differ in size? And I sort of feel I missed that, whether it was matched for size in some way.
Okay, a few things. So for the second point you made, like about personal cost, I think that's a very good point again. One thing to probably help rule out this hypothesis is that most of the effect that we find is in firms that are larger, so in which we do not believe that the CEO is the owner and the manager, in public firms. So like all the effect that we identify is in public firms. So again, I don't really think that Rex Tillerson is going to ever field, and he's the guy that is making like the decision to invest. So I think this gives us a little bit of like certainty about what we're identifying is not coming from that thing. In terms of size,
right?
Sorry?
Go ahead. The only thought, I mean, in my mind, my alternative story was like for really small firms, I won't expect, in the alternative story that I was saying, really small firms, I won't expect an effect. Suppose a firm has only 3 projects. Now the CEO has a lot of time. It doesn't matter how far spread out they are. Then there is these medium-sized firms where the projects are large enough that the CEO is constrained for time. And that is where you would sort of see the effect that you want to have some projects close to the CEO, whatever this medium size is. And then in the huge firms, the CEO doesn't bother with managing individual projects anyway. Every project has their own manager and the CEO manages the managers. So there again, I wouldn't see this, but I don't know what this medium size would be in my alternative story. So it depends on, so I'm not very sure as to whether it fits with the size pattern that you see or not in terms of this.
Okay, that's interesting. We did not think of that. So I cannot really give you more on that, but like this is something that we can think about. That's interesting. And in terms of the size, we have a few controls that control for firm size, and then we do multiple cuts in the data, but we don't do a matching exercise here.
No, all I asked, the only thing is I wanted to be, I mean, I find the private versus public very compelling, but because I have this alternative story in mind, which is size related, I want to make sure I mean, I'm stuck on that story. I want to make sure this private and public is matched for size, in which case that story is controlled for, and that is not showing up in some way in the private public.
Of course.
But of course, I mean, this is just one story, but.
That's a good point. We'll try to think more about that in the next iteration. I cannot give you more here, but sure, that's a good point. Thank you.
So perhaps this is follow on to Rick, because look, I mean, when I read your paper, Paul, I think that we always recognize that people have, respond to incentives, and I think that what was disturbing about this paper is that the usual governance mechanism that we all trust when we think about firms and what they're supposed to be doing gets disturbed by the story, right? You have a board, you have a CEO, you have separate management, and yet this is showing up. In India, we have firms where we have CEOs who are generally considered to be quite powerful people. And so perhaps to Rick's point, and the thing about the fact that your results show that public firms are the ones where you see this effect as opposed to private firms. To what extent might this story be affected by the shareholding that the CEO has? So for instance, in finance, we have this entire backstory about how if you gave ESOPs as the performance linked bonus in a certain sense, you take away some of the troubles that you might get for a financial firm pushing to get targets met. Whereas in this case, if you have options or the shareholding of the CEO going up higher and higher, they become more and more powerful in the kind of decisions that they can take on behalf of the firm. Is that a piece of information that we can observe about the CEOs of these firms? And perhaps that's one way to capture this entire small, medium, and very large shareholding pattern, where if you have firms where the CEO has got a larger and larger say just because of shareholding control, then is that something that shows up as an explanation for how poorly the CEO pet projects perform and hits upon the firm's performance as compared to those firms where the CEO is just like any other shareholder or just a professional manager?
That's a super good point. So this is something that we investigated somewhat in the early version of the paper. A few things on that. First, we have much less observations when we look at the data sets that include CEO ownership because it cuts a large fraction of our sample. But the way we were thinking about that in the early version of the paper was about skin in the game. So if the CEO owns share in the firm, then his interest is much better aligned with any other shareholders of that firm. And so we should not see, or we should see a weaker negative performance of the result in the data. This is something that we did observe empirically, but it was not statistically significant. The issue with that is we don't know if it's a sample size issue or if it's just that it's not really popping up in the empirics. Okay. But that's an excellent point.
No, and the other thing that I think came to mind while reading your paper is here in this paper, you can actually see that the performance is taking a hit. What happens in firms or sectors where performance is not so readily pinned down? So for instance, we were just talking in the first paper about ESG investments or similarly active fund management, where people who are running the funds can be taking these decisions, which are pet projects of theirs, and yet we cannot tell because the performance is far out. It's something which has got a very wide variance. And so in that case, how are we supposed to be thinking about this problem? And how do we link, is there a way to link it back to the entire domain of CEO pet projects? That's the other question that came up to my mind when I was reading your paper. Right? What when performance is not so easily measured? Can we see that there's much more rampant implementation of this type of CEO pet project?
That is, again, a very good question. So what this environment enables us to do is to get a very clear measure of performance, which I believe is the main benefit of working in this environment. I think from a conceptual standpoint, what it suggests is that CEOs tend to allocate firm resources to their own personal benefits to some degree. Like you can think of like recent evidence with Jeff Bezos that said when he flew to space, he just yelled, "You all paid for this." I think this is evidence of like CEOs tunneling firm resources to projects that are not necessarily NPV positive, or at least not maximizing shareholder value. Those cases are hard to measure, but we all have this, at least I do have this personal feeling that those projects might not be like necessarily the best allocation of resource at the moment. But as you said, in most environment, it's hard to quantify exactly what are the gains or the costs.
Okay, so that brings me to the last question, right? I mean, I don't know how mature this paper is and how frequently you presented it, but certainly in terms of your conversations with this industry, is it the case that when they see these results, right, is there a response? Is there a reaction? I mean, we know in financial markets, when a research paper of this nature comes up showing that there's a gap between what should be and what is, Eventually when the research comes out in the public, there is a response and the market connects. So what is, have you had a chance to talk to the industry? What is their response? Has anything changed since then? Or are you
two things on
published?
That's funny. Two things on that. The first one is we haven't received any threatening emails, so I'm guessing that they're fine with that.
That is something of big concern. Maybe it's the difference in geographical locations of you and me, but I would think that if I had something like this, I'd be terrified.
But to that point, one of our discussion made an amazing point, which is something that we'll borrow in the next iteration. There are some cases that went public for exactly this type of behavior. So like there are two big cases. One that I remember was with Devon Energy, and another one that was public even more recently, where those CEOs have been sued by the shareholders because they were publicly investing in land value, in land where the firm was also drilling. So like those cases have been happening in the data. Like we've seen that in the news. So like in the new version of the paper, Denis and I are planning to bring back a little bit more of newsworthy examples.
Right. Okay. No, I mean, and I guess sitting here, we of course worry about the fact that in India, we have, public is not, listed companies. A public is those firms that have got a majority shareholding by the government, where there is even less accountability. And this is something that we worry about all the time. And if it is happening in a country with good contract enforcement, good legal frameworks, presumably better governance than we have. In the case of government, in the case of a government-backed company, we suspect that this is even more likely to happen. It'd be good to figure out how we can deploy your analysis in the Indian context and see whether there's some evidence that we can gather. So perhaps we should talk at some point.
Of course, absolutely. I think there are very nice papers that have been written about how government employees get bribed in India, right? This recent AER paper that shows that you can pay to get a government job.
Well, yeah, so there are a lot of listed government, public sector for us is government as a majority shareholder. There are a lot of listed public sector firms, and it's a thought. I don't know whether there's anything that can be done.
Yeah,
Rick, you were saying that, you're the econometrician, so.
Data will be the main, the main advantage is Paul and Denis have is the kind of detailed data they have. That's
and it's also focused in one sector, where I think that the links between the CEO's actions at the firms.
Right.
Very, very
I had another sort of follow-up minor point based on what Susan raised in the beginning. So you make a bad decision, your land value goes up, okay? So you gain privately on that. And then on the other hand, I'm thinking you own some shares and there's some variation there. So you make a bad decision, you lose that. Because the increase in land value is not, the land value increases more generally. You don't capture all of it. So it's not fully efficient in some sense. So it is possible that even if you don't hold 100% of the firm, let's say you hold only 5% of the firm, these are small firms, so it's maybe possible here. It is possible that that is enough to offset it, meaning it's not worth it. So what I was thinking is whether, what I didn't get a sense of is in the data, to the extent that you know how much the CEO holds, could you sort of contrast it with whatever this 300,000 or whatever number you showed, the increase in land value, but more as a ratio. So if this is the increase in land value, this is the drop in their personal value of the shares, how does it compare, and in what fraction of the cases would this go the other way? Is it like very small? Is it moderate? Or
That again is, Rick, you're making tons of very good points. We absolutely agree with you again here. So this is something that is not in the actual version of the paper, that is coming up in the new iteration. And so two things on that. The first one is, as we mentioned, like it's in large public firms that we see most of the effect. And we don't see that in all of the projects that they're doing. We see that concentrated in a few subset of projects. So to take a broader scope to discuss this thing is thinking about like the economic gains versus the cost that they get, but also about career concern. If you were to do only bad projects for your personal benefits, you would expect those guys to get fired. And so the way we look at the data and the way we think about this dimension of the data is that the firms in which we observe this negative performance are large. So they do hundreds of wells in a year, but a few of those projects bring them private benefits. And so the way we're thinking about that is that there's large private benefits that accrue to them, but it's small cost to the firm. And so like the overarching result is that the firm does not really bear much of a cost, but they get to stand, they get to benefit a lot out of it. So that's the way we think about it.
There might be something, anyway, there might be something interesting to spillovers of PCO pet projects to other people who had nothing to do with this. But anyway, we'll talk about it later sometime. You see, somebody else will gain because of that, right?
Yeah, no, that is correct. And so if you look at the graph, like in the new version, we'll get that graph. If you look at land value, one thing that the Discussant raised, I think last week, was that you would expect that then landowners that have land next to the CEO's land would somewhat anticipate this thing, and there would be some pre-trend before exploration starts. We don't see that in the data. So there doesn't seem to be much anticipation. We don't have a strong answer to that. It seems that they're not taking that into account. That's pretty much the way.
That's plausible, yeah. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Sorry, anybody else with questions? Okay. Thank you.